I used to believe that Friday at the lake house was the day my marriage began to fall apart. That's the story I told myself for years. But looking back now, I understand something far more unsettling. It had already ended long before I ever turned into that driveway. At the time, I didn't see betrayal. I didn't see another woman. I didn't even see a warning sign. What I saw was a life that still looked familiar. And sometimes, that's the most dangerous thing of all. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. For 23 years, I thought I understood my husband. Thomas was a man of routines. He drank his coffee black, woke at 5:30 every morning, and read the financial section before anyone else in the house stirred. He managed a private equity firm in the city, the kind of work that required discretion and long hours. We lived comfortably. More than comfortably. Our home sat on 4 acres in Westchester County, with gardens I'd spent years cultivating and rooms that still smelled faintly of the lemon polish our housekeeper used every Thursday. We had 2 children, both grown now, living their own lives in different cities. Our marriage looked like what people my age call successful, stable, predictable, safe. But I realize now that I didn't misunderstand him. I misunderstood the silence. There's a difference between a man who is quiet by nature and a man who has stopped speaking because there's nothing left to say. For years, I confused the two. Thomas had always been reserved. He wasn't the type to share his feelings openly or discuss the nuances of his day over dinner. That was fine with me. I'd grown up in a household where emotions were kept private, where love was demonstrated through actions rather than words. So when Thomas stopped asking about my day, I didn't notice at first. When he stopped commenting on the meals I prepared or the books I recommended, I told myself he was distracted. Work was demanding. The markets were volatile. He had responsibilities. I filled the silence with my own life. I volunteered at the Historical Society. I took watercolor classes on Tuesday mornings. I met friends for lunch and discussed books we were reading, trips we were planning, grandchildren we were hoping for. My days were full. And I told myself that was enough. I told myself that marriage at this stage wasn't supposed to be passionate or consuming. It was supposed to be comfortable, a partnership built on decades of shared history, mutual respect, and the unspoken agreement that we'd chosen each other once and didn't need to keep choosing. But comfort, I've learned, can be a kind of camouflage. It hides the places where connection has been replaced by routine, where intimacy has been replaced by politeness, where love has been replaced by the absence of conflict. The lake house was Thomas's idea, though he framed it as something we'd always talked about, a place to retreat on weekends, away from the city's noise and the demands of our regular lives. It was a beautiful property, nestled on the edge of a private lake about 2 hours north. The realtor had called it a hidden gem, and she wasn't wrong. The house itself was modest by our standards, a renovated cabin with wide windows overlooking the water, a stone fireplace, and a dock where you could sit in the evenings and watch the light change across the lake. Thomas signed the papers without much discussion. He said it would be good for us. A fresh start, he called it. I didn't ask what we were starting fresh from. I should have. Looking back, the pattern had been there for at least 2 years before the lake house, maybe longer. It wasn't dramatic. There were no arguments, no slammed doors, no accusations hurled in anger. If anything, the absence of conflict made it easier to ignore. Thomas and I had simply stopped inhabiting the same emotional space. We still shared a home, a bed, a last name. But somewhere along the way, we'd stopped sharing a life. The first sign, though I didn't recognize it as such, was the way decisions stopped being made together. Thomas bought the lake house without asking for my input beyond a cursory, "You'll love it, Claire." He scheduled trips without checking my calendar. He made plans with colleagues and informed me afterward, as if my presence was optional or assumed but not necessary to confirm. I told myself this was normal. After more than 2 decades together, couples didn't need to consult each other on every detail. We trusted each other's judgment. We gave each other space. But space and distance aren't the same thing, and I was learning the difference too late. There were smaller things too. The way Thomas no longer lingered over breakfast. The way he'd take his coffee to his study and close the door, working through emails or calls that apparently couldn't wait. The way he'd come to bed after I was already asleep, or claim he was too wired to sleep and would stay up reading in the guest room so he wouldn't disturb me. Acts of consideration, on the surface. But over time, those considerations added up to a life lived separately under the same roof. Our conversations became transactional. Did you call the landscaper? The insurance is renewing next month. Your mother called. She wants to know if we're coming for Thanksgiving. We stopped talking about ideas, about feelings, about anything that required vulnerability or depth. And because I'd never been someone who demanded emotional intensity, I adapted. I found fulfillment in other places, my friendships, my hobbies, the quiet satisfaction of a well-tended garden. I convinced myself that this was maturity, that expecting more from a marriage at our age was unrealistic, even selfish. I told myself that passion fades, that companionship was what remained, and that I should be grateful for what we had instead of mourning what we'd lost. Wealth made it easier to ignore the cracks. When you have resources, you can insulate yourself from discomfort. You can hire people to handle the things you don't want to deal with. You can travel when the house feels too quiet. You can fill your calendar with commitments that make you feel purposeful and connected, even if the most important connection in your life is fraying. Thomas and I didn't fight about money. We didn't fight about much of anything. And that, I think, was the problem. Fighting requires engagement. It requires caring enough to disagree, to push back, to demand something different. We'd stopped fighting because we'd stopped expecting anything from each other. We'd become polite strangers who shared an address and a history, but no longer shared a future we were actively building together. There were moments when I almost asked, almost said, "Are we okay? Are you happy? Do you still want this?" But I didn't, because I was afraid of the answer. And because asking the question would have shattered the illusion I'd worked so hard to maintain. The illusion that everything was fine, that we were fine, that the life we'd built was solid and enduring, even if it no longer felt particularly alive. So, I stayed quiet. I kept my doubts to myself. I focused on the things I could control, the small rituals and routines that gave my days structure and meaning. And I told myself that this was enough, that wanting more was childish, that I should be content with stability, even if that stability felt increasingly hollow. The first time we went to the lake house together, it was late September. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air had that crisp quality that comes with early autumn. Thomas drove. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the landscape change as we left the suburbs behind and moved into more rural terrain. He seemed lighter that day, more present than he'd been in months. He pointed out landmarks along the way, talked about the area's history, mentioned a hiking trail he wanted to try. I remember thinking that maybe this place would be good for us. Maybe getting away from our regular routines would help us reconnect. Maybe I'd been worrying over nothing. The house was as beautiful as the photos had suggested. Maybe more so. It sat on a slight rise, with the lake visible through the trees. The interior was open and airy, with wood beams and large windows that let in generous amounts of natural light. There was a simplicity to it that I appreciated. No pretense, no excess, just clean lines and comfortable spaces. Thomas gave me a tour, showing me the kitchen, the bedroom, the deck that wrapped around the back of the house. He'd already stocked the pantry and the refrigerator. He'd thought of everything. I should have been touched. Instead, I felt a strange unease I couldn't name. It was as if he'd created this space without me, and I was being introduced to it, rather than discovering it together. That first evening, we sat on the deck with glasses of wine, watching the sun set over the water. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, but it wasn't companionable either. It was the kind of silence that exists when two people are thinking different things and don't know how to bridge the gap. Thomas seemed content, relaxed. He made comments about the view, about how peaceful it was, about how glad he was we'd bought the place. I agreed. I said all the right things, but inside, I felt a growing sense of disconnection. This was supposed to bring us closer. So why did I feel further away? That night, I woke to find Thomas's side of the bed empty. I got up, thinking he might be in the kitchen or out on the deck, but he wasn't. I found him in the second bedroom, the smaller one we'd talked about using as a guest room. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, staring at his phone. The light from the screen illuminated his face in the darkness. He didn't hear me approach at first. When he finally looked up, he seemed startled, almost guilty. "Couldn't sleep," he said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Didn't want to wake you." I told him it was fine, that I understood, but as I walked back to our room, I felt a coldness settle in my chest. Something was wrong. I didn't know what, but I knew. Over the next few months, we returned to the lake house regularly. Thomas insisted on it. Even when I suggested we skip a weekend or stay home, he said it was important, that we needed this, that the change of scenery was good for both of us, and in some ways, he was right. The lake was beautiful, the house was peaceful, but our relationship didn't improve. If anything, the isolation made the distance between us more obvious. At home, we could hide behind busy schedules and separate routines. At the lake, there were no distractions, just the two of us, in a quiet house, trying to fill the hours with activities that didn't require meaningful conversation. We took walks, we read books, we prepared meals, but we didn't talk, not really, and the silence grew heavier with every visit. There was one detail that stayed with me, though I didn't understand its significance at the time. Thomas had a habit of driving into town on Saturday mornings. He'd say he needed to pick up groceries or check on something at the hardware store. He'd be gone for an hour, sometimes two. When he returned, he'd be in a good mood, almost cheerful. At the time, I thought nothing of it. I was usually glad for the solitude, the chance to drink my coffee in peace and enjoy the morning without feeling the weight of our unspoken tension. But later, when I understood what had really been happening, I realized that those Saturday mornings weren't about groceries or errands. They were about escape, or more accurately, they were about someone else. That calm wasn't confidence. It was habit. If you're still watching, comment, "I'm still watching," and let us know where you're watching from. It tells me you understand. This story isn't loud, but it matters. I've spent a lot of time thinking about why I didn't ask the hard questions sooner, why I didn't confront Thomas when my instincts told me something was wrong. And the truth is, I was protecting myself, not from the truth, exactly, but from the disruption the truth would cause. I'd built a life that worked. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I had routines I enjoyed, relationships I valued, a sense of identity that didn't depend entirely on my marriage. Asking the hard questions would have meant risking all of that. It would have meant acknowledging that the foundation I'd built my life on was shakier than I wanted to admit. So I told myself stories, reassuring stories, stories that let me stay comfortable. I told myself that Thomas was stressed, that work was overwhelming, that he needed space, and I should respect that. I told myself that all marriages go through phases, that this distance was temporary, that we'd reconnect eventually, once things settled down. I told myself that I was being mature by not demanding more, that needing constant attention or affection was needy, that independence was healthier. I told myself that the life we'd built together, the years we'd invested, the children we'd raised, all of that mattered more than the current absence of intimacy. I told myself I was being patient, but patience and avoidance aren't the same thing. I wasn't being foolish. I was being careful, with the wrong thing. I was protecting my comfort instead of protecting my marriage. I was preserving the appearance of stability instead of confronting the reality of disconnection. And in doing so, I gave Thomas permission to drift further away. Because when you don't ask questions, people assume you don't want answers. When you don't express needs, people assume you don't have any. I'd become so good at being self-sufficient, so practiced at not being a burden, that I'd made myself invisible, not intentionally, but effectively. Thomas no longer had to consider my feelings because I no longer expressed them. He no longer had to prioritize our relationship because I never suggested it was a priority. I'd adapted so completely to his absence that he no longer noticed I was there. There were moments when I almost broke the pattern, moments when I felt the urge to sit him down and say, "We need to talk, really talk, about us, about where we are and where we're going." But every time I got close, I'd pull back. I'd tell myself it wasn't the right time, that he was too busy, that I was overreacting, that things weren't as bad as they seemed. I'd find reasons to wait, and waiting became its own kind of decision, a decision to stay in the discomfort I knew rather than risk the unknown that confrontation might bring. Because confrontation meant uncertainty, It meant the possibility that Thomas would confirm what I was afraid to know, that he'd stopped loving me, that he wanted out, that our marriage was already over, and I was the only one still pretending otherwise. Looking back, I wonder if he knew, if he sensed that I was choosing not to see, if my silence gave him permission to continue. I'd like to think he struggled with guilt, that he wrestled with what he was doing and what it was costing, but I don't know. I never asked. And by the time I found out, it was too late for those kinds of conversations. The thing about betrayal is that it recontextualizes everything. Once you know, you can't unknow. And every memory, every conversation, every moment you thought was innocent takes on a different meaning. You realize how much you missed, how many signs you ignored, how many times you chose to believe a comfortable lie rather than face an uncomfortable truth. And that realization is its own kind of grief, not just for what you lost, but for how long you lost it without even knowing. It was a Friday in late November. We'd planned to go to the lake house for the weekend, but I'd come down with a cold the day before and didn't feel up to the drive. I told Thomas to go without me. I'd stay home, rest, maybe catch up on some reading. He hesitated at first, said he didn't want to leave me alone if I wasn't feeling well. But I insisted. I told him the fresh air would do him good, that I'd be fine, that I'd probably sleep most of the weekend anyway. So he went. He left Friday morning, kissed me on the forehead, told me to call if I needed anything, and I spent the day in bed, dozing on and off, drinking tea, half watching television shows I didn't really care about. By Saturday afternoon, I was feeling better, restless, even. I got up, showered, made myself something to eat. I thought about calling Thomas but decided against it. He was probably out on a hike or reading on the deck. I didn't want to interrupt. Instead, I decided to organize some files in Thomas's study. He'd been complaining about needing to clear out old paperwork, and I thought I'd surprise him by tackling it while he was away. It seemed like a nice gesture, a way to be helpful. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't suspicious. I was just trying to be useful. But that's how it happens, isn't it? You're not looking, and then suddenly you find something you can't ignore. I found the phone in the bottom drawer of his desk, tucked under a stack of old bank statements. It was an older model, a flip phone, the kind people barely use anymore. At first, I thought it was just an old phone he'd forgotten about, but when I opened it, it powered on immediately, fully charged, and there were messages, dozens of them, from a contact saved simply as L. The messages weren't explicit. They didn't need to be. The tone, the familiarity, the intimacy, it was all there. Miss you already. Can't wait for next weekend. You make me feel alive again. I sat there, staring at the screen, reading message after message, feeling my entire reality shift. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This was a relationship. An ongoing, intentional, carefully hidden relationship. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes. Maybe longer. My hands were shaking. My mind was racing. Part of me wanted to call Thomas immediately, to demand an explanation, to scream, to cry. But another part of me, the part that had spent years avoiding confrontation, told me to wait, to think, to figure out what I wanted to do before I did anything I couldn't take back. So I put the phone back where I found it. I closed the drawer. I walked out of the study and back to the bedroom, and I lay down and stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I'd just learned, trying to reconcile the man I thought I knew with the man who'd been lying to me for God knows how long. The next day, Thomas came home. He was in a good mood. He asked how I was feeling, said he'd missed me, talked about his weekend at the lake. He seemed so normal, so untroubled, and I realized, with a sickening clarity, that this was who he'd become. Someone who could lie to my face and feel nothing. Someone who could live a double life and compartmentalize it so completely that he never slipped. Someone I didn't recognize. I didn't say anything that day, or the next. I told myself I needed time. I needed to think. I needed to decide what I wanted. But the truth was, I was in shock. I couldn't process it, couldn't reconcile what I knew with what I'd believed. So I did what I'd always done. I stayed quiet. I observed. I waited. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things I'd missed before. The way Thomas showered as soon as he got home from the lake house, The way he was careful never to leave his regular phone unattended. The way he'd become suddenly interested in his appearance, buying new clothes, going to the gym more regularly, using cologne I'd never smelled before. Small things. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. He wasn't just having an affair, he was building a separate life, and I was the obstacle in the way of it. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself, because it meant I wasn't a person to him anymore. I was a problem, something to be managed, something to be worked around. I'd become invisible in my own marriage. Here's what I wish someone had told me years earlier. When you stop expressing your needs in a relationship, you're not being mature or low maintenance. You're teaching the other person that your feelings don't require consideration. I thought I was being understanding by not demanding attention or affection, but what I was actually doing was erasing myself, bit by bit, choice by choice, until I became so easy to overlook that Thomas forgot I was even there. The lesson isn't about the affair. It's about what happened long before the affair. I'd spent years prioritizing peace over honesty, avoiding discomfort over addressing problems, and in doing so, I'd made myself optional in my own marriage. If you're watching this and recognizing yourself, hear me clearly. Your needs matter. Your feelings matter. Asking for what you want isn't selfish. It's necessary. Because a relationship where one person silences themselves to keep the peace isn't peaceful. It's just quiet. And there's a difference. A significant one. Don't make the mistake I made. Don't wait until you're invisible to start speaking up. By then, you're not reclaiming your voice. You're introducing yourself to someone who's forgotten you exist. I could have confronted him immediately. I could have thrown the evidence in his face and demanded answers. Part of me wanted to, but I didn't, because I realized something important. Confrontation would give him control. It would put me in the position of asking for explanations, for apologies, for reassurances that I no longer wanted or believed. It would make me the wronged party begging for scraps of honesty from someone who'd already proven he had none to give. And I didn't want that. I didn't want to perform the role of the betrayed wife, crying and pleading and trying to hold together something that was already destroyed. So I made a different choice. I decided to take my time, to think, to plan, to decide what I wanted my life to look like without him, before I told him he was no longer part of it. I started with practical matters. I made an appointment with a lawyer, a woman who came highly recommended and specialized in complex asset division. I told her everything. She listened without judgment and laid out my options. New York is an equitable distribution state, she explained. That meant assets would be divided fairly, though not necessarily equally. Given the length of the marriage and my contributions, both financial and otherwise, I had a strong case. She asked if I wanted to pursue litigation or attempt mediation. I told her I'd think about it. I wasn't ready to make that decision yet, but I wanted to know what my options were. I wanted to understand what life after Thomas could look like, and I wanted to be prepared. I also started documenting, not obsessively, but carefully. I took note of Thomas's patterns. When he went to the lake house, how often, how long he stayed. I kept a log of his absences, his excuses, his explanations. I didn't confront him about the phone, but I checked it periodically when he wasn't home. I took screenshots of messages. I noted dates and times, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted proof. I wanted a record that couldn't be disputed or explained away. I wanted to make sure that when the time came, I had everything I needed to protect myself, because I'd learned that trusting someone's word meant nothing if their actions told a different story. During this time, something unexpected happened. I started to feel lighter. Not happy, exactly, but free, because the uncertainty was gone. I no longer had to wonder if I was imagining things or overreacting. I no longer had to perform the role of the contented wife who asked for nothing. I could see the situation clearly for what it was, and with that clarity came a sense of power I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't a victim. I was someone making choices, deliberate, strategic choices about my future, and that felt like reclaiming a part of myself I'd lost somewhere along the way, the part that knew what she wanted and wasn't afraid to pursue it. I also started thinking about Elle, the woman on the other end of those messages. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know how they'd met or how long it had been going on. And strangely, I didn't care. She wasn't the problem. Thomas was. He'd made the choice to betray me. He'd made the choice to lie. She was just a symptom of a decision he'd already made. And hating her would have been a waste of energy I didn't have. Instead, I focused on myself, on what I wanted, on what kind of life I wanted to build once this chapter was over. I started imagining it in detail, where I'd live, how I'd spend my days, the people I'd surround myself with, and slowly, that vision became more real to me than the life I was currently living. In mid-December, Thomas suggested we host a holiday party. It was something we did every year, a gathering of friends and colleagues at our home. I agreed. Not because I wanted to, but because I wasn't ready to reveal what I knew. Not yet. So I played the role. I planned the menu. I sent the invitations. I decorated the house. And on the night of the party, I stood beside Thomas, smiling and greeting guests, playing the part of the happy couple. It was surreal, almost performative, because I knew it was the last time. The last time I'd pretend. The last time I'd protect his image. The last time I'd prioritize his comfort over my own truth. After the party, after the guests left, and the house was quiet again, I went upstairs and packed a bag. Not much, just enough for a few days. And the next morning, I told Thomas I was going to visit my sister. He didn't question it. He seemed relieved, actually, as if my absence gave him more room to breathe. I didn't tell him I wasn't coming back. I stayed with my sister for a week. During that time, I finalized my decision. I contacted my lawyer and told her I was ready to proceed. She drafted the paperwork. I reviewed it. I signed it. And then I had it delivered to Thomas at his office. I didn't want to be there when he received it. I didn't want to see his reaction or hear his excuses. I'd already said everything I needed to say, in writing, through my lawyer. The divorce papers outlined everything, the asset division, the terms, the timeline. It was all there, clear and final, and there was nothing left to negotiate. I wasn't asking for his approval. I was informing him of a decision I'd already made. Thomas tried to call. Multiple times. I didn't answer. He sent emails. I didn't respond. He showed up at my sister's house. I refused to see him. Eventually, he hired his own lawyer, and we communicated only through legal channels. The process took months. It wasn't pleasant, but it was necessary. And through it all, I held firm. I didn't waver. I didn't second guess. I knew what I wanted, and I pursued it with a clarity I'd never felt before. In the end, the settlement was fair. I kept the house in Westchester. Thomas kept the lake house. We divided our assets equitably, and we went our separate ways. I learned later, through mutual friends, that Thomas moved to the lake house full-time, that Elle was a woman he'd met at a bookstore in the town nearby, that they'd been seeing each other for over 2 years, that he'd bought the lake house, at least in part, to be closer to her. The information didn't hurt as much as I thought it would, because by then, I'd already moved on, not into another relationship, but into a life that felt more authentically mine than anything I'd had in years. I traveled. I reconnected with old friends. I took up painting again, something I'd loved in college but had abandoned when life got busy. I created routines that pleased me, and I discovered that I didn't need Thomas to feel complete. I'd been complete all along. I'd just forgotten. What would you have done in my place? Spoken up sooner, or waited like I did? Would you have confronted immediately, or taken the time to plan? There's no right answer. Every situation is different. Every person has to make the choice that feels right for them. But what I learned is this: power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply stops explaining. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away without needing the other person to understand why. Stories like this are rarely told twice. If you don't subscribe now, you'll miss the ones people only find the courage to tell once. And if you think this was unsettling, the next story begins with a lie no one questioned for decades.